As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
One of the interesting things about exposure therapy is that even though it's the gold standard treatment for anxiety, panic disorder, and OCD, there's still a lot of room for growth, right? And some more recent research has suggested that the mechanism that we thought was pivotal to exposure therapy, which we identified as habituation, may not actually be how it works. That might be more of the outcome, like a side effect, and that maybe there's some other processes underneath it.
That was Brian Pilecki and Brian Thompson on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are three clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act Daily Journal, the Act Daily Card Deck, and the upcoming book, Act for Burnout.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the book Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of Act Metaphors, and the upcoming Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. I'm here with Debbie to introduce today's episode with Doctors Brian Pilecki and Brian Thompson. So we have two Brians, which can make things a little bit confusing, but hopefully not too much. And if you have ever been curious about exposure therapy, this is the episode for you. So you may have seen exposure therapy. VH1 used to have a show called The OCD Project with David Tolan, who is a pretty world famous OCD expert. And it was all about exposure therapy. And, exposure therapy, we talk in the episode about exactly what it is, but the sort of like easy way to think about it is that it's about facing your fear and sort of learning that when you face your fear, the terrible things you're afraid are going to happen typically don't, or even if they do, they're not so bad and you can handle it. And so as therapists, this is like one of my most favorite parts of my job because it's where we get to be really creative and to challenge folks to face their fear in myriad ways. And Debbie, I'm wondering if you had any examples that you wanted to share in terms of your life with exposure therapy.
Yeah, first of all, I'll just say that I think that it's pretty important to have some type of exposure therapy component in there somehow if you're working with anxiety. Well, certain forms of anxiety, maybe more than others, but a lot of times if you're working with someone with a phobia or even with trauma or with some of the other anxiety conditions that really are, tend to lead to avoidance, there really has to be some type of exposure work in there somehow, because if not, it's like you can talk about anxiety all day long and it doesn't do a whole lot of good. And I think it is kind of interesting how people get creative doing exposure work.
And even for listeners, if you have something you're kind of more mildly afraid of, like you don't have to have an anxiety, quote unquote, disorder to benefit from finding ways to face your fear.
Yeah, I have a mild fear of heights and it doesn't get in the way too often because I don't really do things where you have to jump off a bridge or anything like that. But I occasionally do, and I like to just play around with it. It's really not debilitating to me, but I challenged myself recently to jump off something high into the water, even though I really didn't want to. My kids were making fun of me because I was So they're doing it no problem. And I was like sheepishly approaching, but because I know that, what I don't want it to do is hold me back in my life. But I think of a professor that I had when I was doing my clinical training. His name was Brian Ott, and he taught our cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety class. And he showed us this video that was just so fun and interesting to watch, because he did the hardcore exposure therapy. That was his bread and butter. So he would go driving around town with people with a driving phobia, and he videotaped real clients, and they'd be in there, he'd be telling them to drive near a semi on the highway, and they're just, the person's terrified, but they're laughing. And he's literally doing therapy in the car with the person who's driving down the highway, trying to increase their level of anxiety, like, oh no, I think that semi is getting really close. And I mean, I was so stunned by it because I was early in my clinical training. I had never seen a depiction of such outside the box therapy.
It's so funny you say that, because this is my bread and butter too. Like, this is how I was trained right from the beginning. And you're making me remember this time where a journalist named Lauren Slater, this was years ago, came to our clinic. So I did my training. It's called the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, that at the time was run by David Barlow, who's a world-renowned anxiety expert. And Lauren Slater came to do a piece. I think it's in the New York Times Magazine. We can link to it. I'm sure we can find it on Google. And it was all about exposure therapy. And she titled this piece, "The Cruelest Cure," and was basically, saying that like, oh, making people face their fear is cruel, except for the fact that not only does it work, if you ask clients about it, they will say it was hard, but I felt strong and empowered and free and liberated. Like, the words you hear from them is like, they would never say it was the cruelest cure. But here's the funny part. While the journalist and her photographers were at the clinic, she was filming some of these exposures that we were doing. And my colleague Laura was doing claustrophobia exposures with a client. And of course, the client gave permission to have his photo taken. And Laura had already done so many exposures in so many ways. She was getting stuck. Like, what do I do next? I need something harder than what I've already done, and I'm not sure what else to do. And I said, well, have you put him in a trunk of a car yet? And she was like, nope, that's what I'll do. And that's the picture that's on the cover of that story, is a guy getting into the trunk of a car. Now, importantly, you never force someone to do something they are not willing to do. The client is always in charge of how much they do, how hard it is, the pace, all of that. So it truly is not cruel. It is a collaborative kind of treatment. But I think out in the world, it's very sensational, right? Like some of the ways, like driving near a semi and getting in a trunk, but it works. And patients actually who complete treatment like it.
Yeah. And there are other forms of this. So just in my practice, a couple things I've done. One is some like in the moment exposure, like when people are feeling anxiety in this session, like let's tune into it. Let's sit down with it. Let's let it be here. Be present with the anxiety. That's like a low level exposure. I often do trauma-related work, and I do written exposure therapy where they write about the trauma or other forms of trauma-related exposure work. And I often have my clients do things between sessions. I'm not there with them, but maybe they have a flying phobia. So it's like, okay, go work on this flight you're taking this weekend, or go talk to a barista at the cafe and strike up a conversation if they have social phobia or something. Well, I'll assign a little exposure work, and then they come back and we talk about it. And sometimes they choose not to do it. That's okay. But there's so many ways you can do it in and out of the session.
Well, yeah. And I think what's important is that the exposure isn't actually to the stimulus. The exposure is to the feeling.
Yes.
And so so like anything that you confront that causes you to feel fear or anxiety or whatever it is, you're doing exposure. So I think that's a really good point. Even if you're just in session, mindfully practicing willingness towards some feeling of anxiety that comes up in that moment, that's exposure. And so I think for listeners who are interested in practicing that, it's really about like finding something that helps to kind of trigger the discomfort that you typically avoid, and then really sitting with that discomfort without avoiding in a really willing, open way. You're really doing exposure. And we talk about that in, much more detail in the rest of the episode. So we hope you learn a lot from this episode on ACT-informed exposure for anxiety. Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I have two guests with me today to talk about two of my favorite topics in psychology, anxiety and acceptance and commitment therapy. So I have Dr. Brian Thompson, who is a licensed psychologist and director of the Anxiety Clinic at the Portland Psychotherapy Clinic Research and Training Center in Portland, Oregon. He completed his doctorate at the University of Montana and specializes in working with anxiety and OCD using acceptance and commitment therapy and exposure therapy. And he has published and offers trainings in these areas. I also have Dr. Brian Pilecki, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders and psychedelic-assisted therapy. He practices from an orientation based in acceptance and commitment therapy and draws on his extensive experience with mindfulness and meditation. Brian is an active researcher and also co-hosts his own podcast called Altered States of Context that focuses on the therapeutic use of psychedelics. And Brian, together with Joanne Chan, co-authored the book Act-Informed Exposure for Anxiety, Creating Effective, Innovative, and Values-Based Exposures Using Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, which we will be talking about today. So Brian, welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you got it. So Brian Pilecki is a return guest. He was here with us with Nate Gaines to talk about psychedelic-assisted therapy. But this is Brian Thompson's first time on Psychologists Off the Clock. And to start, I wanted to say so Steve Hayes, who's the developer of ACT, wrote the foreword for your book. And he wrote, this is, quote, simply the best book available on this topic, end quote. And I thought, wow, that is like quite a ringing endorsement. So congratulations. And I agree. I think it's a phenomenal book and you guys did a really nice job. I think especially you delve pretty deeply into the relational frame theory behind acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as functional contextualism in a way that's like very accessible and reader friendly, which is a hard thing to do. And I don't think a lot of other books have been able to do that. So I really appreciated that part of it.
That's great to hear. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's jump in. I thought what we could start with, there are going to be some listeners who already know what this is, but probably not everyone. So could one of you just sort of briefly tell listeners what is traditional exposure therapy?
So traditional exposure therapy has been around for a number of decades. And over time, there have been different models developed to explain how it works. But generally, most definitions of traditional exposure include something about sort of a systematic contact with stimuli that one usually avoids. Some of your listeners may have seen there's been some reality shows on exposure therapy. Somebody's afraid of dogs, they might be in a graduated fashion exposed to a dog. Maybe they look at pictures of dogs or have a dog come closer. And so sort of traditionally you stay in contact with something that you typically avoid. And in the focus in traditional exposure, and when we talk about traditional exposure, we're often talking about exposure based on what's called emotional processing theory, where the idea is if you stay in contact with something until your anxiety, discomfort drop down, that it helps to promote new learning. And so the focus on traditional exposure is on symptom reduction.
I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but I think you guys will get a kick out of it. When we had a parent-teacher conference with my son, he's 8 years old. It was like his second grade parent-teacher conference. And he happened to be there. And his teacher was talking about what a great vocabulary he has. And that she knew exactly what his mother did for a living because of his vocabulary. And my son said to her, oh, why? Because I say habituation. And she said, yes, that is exactly how we knew that. So that emotional processing piece where people habituate over time when they face their fear, that was something even my little 8-year-old son knew about. And so ACT-informed exposure therapy and traditional exposure certainly share some similarities, but there are certainly some differences both in terms of theory and practice. But before we get into that, if we look at research comparing the efficacy, right? If we compare traditional exposure to ACT, they're essentially equally effective. And so I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what is it that ACT adds? Like, what's the rationale for why we would want to do ACT-informed exposure therapy over traditional exposure therapy?
I actually struggled with that question in writing the book, in that here you have this treatment, you have traditional exposure. It offers something that clients want to hear, symptom reduction. So how do you make a case for something that's newer that, as you said, Jill, at least on primary outcomes, tends to be as effective, but not necessarily more effective than the older model? I think with ACT-informed exposure, there's some evidence it helps with co-occurring mood disorders, depression, things like that. But for the most part, they seem to perform about the same. And in sort of writing this book, I really tried to think through the lens of, how would someone who's trained in traditional exposure approach this? I didn't necessarily want to write this for an ACT audience. One thing, and this is something in sort of working with ACT-informed exposure over a number of years, is something I've kind of gradually come to appreciate in different ways, is there's a lot going on in exposure. And I feel that ACT has a vocabulary to describe and talk about things in exposure. For example, in traditional exposure, the idea of acceptance is important. That if somebody sort of tenses up, tries to get through an exposure, we know that that can interfere with the learning associated with the exposure. And so acceptance is vitally important in traditional exposure. However, they don't necessarily have a vocabulary to talk about it. Whereas in ACT, there's a number of metaphors, experiential exercises, and ways of talking about acceptance. And other things as well. There's in ACT kind of diffusion from thoughts, sort of getting distance from thoughts. And so without kind of going into the vocabulary, I feel like ACT has a way of talking about exposure in a more granular way in order to see things that show up really in any form of exposure.
Yeah, and that then becomes, I think where ACT is a transdiagnostic treatment, it becomes a vocabulary that, maybe you're in therapy because you have a spider phobia or a panic disorder, but then you get in a fight with your partner and you're really struggling, or you experience a death, or any number of things that can come up in this challenging life of ours. And if you've done ACT-informed exposure therapy, you have this treatment that really can very easily be applied to anything that shows up, when the ultimate goal really is just psychological flexibility, right? Brian, Dr. Pilecki, we'll have to differentiate between you two Brians. So we don't usually get real formal on the podcast, but this might have to be the way that I differentiate. Dr. Pilecki, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, a tone that we really try to go for in the book, and that I try to live out in my professional life, is, one of cooperation with other therapy traditions. So the book is we're not asserting the superiority of ACT. And in fact, ACT and traditional exposure, traditional CBT have more in common than they might have different from each other. And that might be a surprise to some of your listeners to learn that therapists, just like other people, can be dogmatic at times too. And so we try to highlight things that traditional exposure and ACT have in common. And then, of course, Brian and I are biased and believe that, ACT has some things to offer. And one of the interesting things about exposure therapy is that even though it's the gold standard treatment for anxiety, panic disorder, and OCD, and the evidence is very strong that it's helpful, there's still a lot of room for growth, right? There's still a lot of people who it doesn't work for. And some more recent research has suggested that the mechanism that we thought was pivotal to exposure therapy, which we identified as habituation, may not actually be how it works. That might be more of the outcome, like a side effect, and that maybe there's some other processes underneath it. So in the last, couple of decades, there's been more of an opening to bring in newer theories and perspectives to try to enhance exposure and, just continue to increase its effectiveness.
Yeah, I've loved to see that cooperation that not that my camp is right, your camp is wrong. I mean, and it's funny, I even noticed in the book, you cite, so some of the early detractors or maybe skeptics, when ACT first came around, included Stefan Hoffman, and you cited several of his articles as like, maybe ACT isn't really any different from CBT. And now he is one of the bigger proponents of ACT and the processes that underlie ACT and CBT and what are the mechanisms, the processes. And of course, has written a book about process-based therapy with Steve Hayes. And I think you're right. We still have a long way to go. We don't have a single treatment that quote unquote cures 100% of the people 100% of the way, 100% of the time. And the more we can come together to say, like, what does the best science tell us? What do we know? And how can we really put these elements together to get the most robust outcomes for people who are suffering? It's so much more important than standing in that dogma saying, my way is the right way. And I think you did a wonderful job really talking about that and explaining that in the book.
To kind of add to what you said there, Jill, you mentioned process-based therapy. I think ACT is, one paper I read, is considered kind of a rudimentary process-based therapy. So I also think that learning ACT-informed exposure is also a stepping stone towards you also use the word transdiagnostic, towards kind of offering a more process-based transdiagnostic treatment that's not kind of bound by a single diagnosis or syndrome.
Right. I mean, it's impossible to train all the therapists with a different manual for every single problem a person might have. And then if you have 3 different diagnoses, which, we could have a whole episode about how real a diagnosis is, right? Then what do you do? 3 different manuals and in what order? And I mean, it just becomes kind of an impossible trap. And I actually just did an ACT training at Rutgers for their counseling and psych services. And one of the things I like to highlight, this comes from my own experience of getting training and then not using it because I just feel overwhelmed and like I'm not expert enough and I don't really know what I'm doing. And one of the things I try to share with new ACT therapists is as long as you are building psychological flexibility, you're doing ACT. And right. And so like if you're doing exposure therapy that is aimed at building psychological flexibility, then you're already well on your way to doing ACT-informed exposure therapy. So actually, maybe before we move on, we've certainly defined psychological flexibility in some episode somewhere, but it's probably been a while. So maybe for listeners who have forgotten what this means or who are newer listeners, would one of you just define psychological flexibility for us?
Sure. I'll take a stab. It always sounds so simple when I say it. Psychological flexibility is in the present moment with what's actually happening, doing what matters. That's like the simplest definition. And I always usually then add after that, like our default is we're not always doing that. In fact, a lot of the time we're reacting to how we're feeling. We're trying to control how things go. We are trying to maximize, positive emotions and minimize negative emotions. And so the idea with psychological flexibility is that it's really behaviorally focused and that we're paying attention to each unique circumstance and trying to be attuned to what is called for and to show up and to respond in our behaviors and our actions in a way that's consistent with who we want to be and what's most important to us.
Yeah. And it is simple. You're right. But it's not easy because we tend to default to that comfort zone, right? If something feels scary and risky and the stakes feel high because we care about it, then it can be hard to put ourselves in that place and be psychologically flexible. But I think the fact that that definition is so simple is, I hope, a way to get people who are newer to the ACT model more willing to kind of dive in and try it, because you really don't have to learn a whole entire manual. Now, of course, in trainings, I still get those questions of like, yeah, but like, what do I do in session 1? And like, what exactly do I say? And I think that's us being a little bit inflexible because it's uncomfortable to have a certain level of uncertainty around what we're doing. But if we can, facilitate getting people to get comfortable being uncomfortable so that they're living a life in accord with their values, then, we're doing ACT. I think the other thing that I love about ACT-informed exposure. And maybe in traditional exposure, they've kind of started doing this a little bit more too, but really is that connection to values that like, we're not just doing exposure for the sake of exposure, but because there's this larger purpose, like you just said, Brian, of living life in line with values. And right before this interview, I actually just finished doing some ACT-informed exposure with a client where some of the exposures we were doing were simply about willingness practices toward certain internal experiences. So we were watching jump scare movie clips, right? So like practicing willingness toward that feeling of like startle and fear. But then we transitioned to him playing the guitar and singing. And this is something that activates his panic. And so he'd been avoiding singing, even though music is something that's really important to him. So I think both of these exposures were beneficial to him, but there was like a spirit, like a feeling to this music exposure. There was like a heart and a soul to it that you could just see it was just more meaningful for him.
And as we're talking, Jill, I realized we defined traditional exposure, but we didn't necessarily define exposure in an ACT context. And I think what you described there is a nice illustration of that. Exposure in an ACT context is a way to practice strengthening psychological flexibility of being able to engage in new behaviors in contexts that narrow behavior. So, and from an ACT perspective, those contexts tend to be internal experiences, thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations that show up. For example, what sort of things do you narrow your client's behavior when he plays guitar?
It's the physical sensation. Mm-hmm. So singing causes him to feel out of breath, which then triggers some of that more cascading, panicky type sensations. I can't catch my breath. And then maybe I feel a little bit shaky, or he notices his heart beating faster. And so it's the desire to avoid those physiological sensations that then he either stops singing halfway or doesn't sing at all.
I think the beauty of exposure is, working with him, you create those conditions that narrow the behavior, that bring up those sensations that he struggles with, so that he can practice expanding behaviors while experiencing those sensations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I like to tell clients, this isn't no pain, no gain therapy, right? It's not just about like feeling pain for the sake of feeling pain, but for this larger behavior repertoire expanding kind of goal. Let's talk a little bit about rule-governed behavior. So in ACT, we talk a lot about wanting to undermine rule-governed behavior. So talk to us about how people who struggle with anxiety and anxiety disorders may get caught up in rule-governed behavior, and then how ACT-informed exposure works to undermine some of those rule-governed behaviors.
We all operate according to these assumptions of how the world works, and those can be useful. If somebody says, don't drink that, that's poison, then we can say, okay, I shouldn't drink that.
We should follow that rule.
Yeah, we don't have to learn that experience. But rule-governed behavior can get us in trouble when it keeps us out of contact with sort of the consequences of our actions. Maybe that drink labeled poison is actually not poison. Maybe it's something really delicious, but we avoid it through the rest of our lives. Or, I think what also happens is, and this comes up a lot with anxiety, is we try things that don't work over and over again, expecting them to work, trying to rationalize or dispute worries or fears, or engaging in internet research, even though it tends to make the anxiety worse. And so, with ACT-informed exposure, it allows us to kind of bring up those things. And I think this is where the repetition comes in, because with the repetition, when you have some sense of what's going to happen, you're kind of like watching a movie multiple times. At first, you're sort of, maybe even sort of fused with the story of the movie. But then once you know what happens, you can step back and see other things more clearly. And so behind a lot of, maybe I'll talk about OCD, behind a lot of obsessions, about fears of what's going to happen, is kind of a more commonplace one of, oh, if I don't engage in the compulsion, or if I don't engage in some sort of avoidance, my anxiety is going to spiral out of control. I'm going to become overwhelmed. And so in staying in the exposure, people are able to step back and say, okay, it's uncomfortable, but my anxiety is not spiraling out of control as I thought it was going to be. I can actually stay with this, or I can actually handle this. And so I think through the repetition, they can sort of contact what's actually going on for them. They can contact their experience. They can notice thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations versus, what their mind says is going to happen. And if you did something once, it might happen so quickly, or it might be so intense that someone might kind of miss what's going on. I think we all have the experience of doing something stressful and sort of doing it almost in a fugue and not really getting up in front of people. And then next thing you know, you're done and walking off and you barely remember what happens. But sort of through repetition, you can then start to see what's going on more clearly and can start to see through some of those verbal rules.
Yeah, essentially, we think that new learning is taking place, that these rules I used to have, if I speak in public, or if I go up high, or if I am with a spider, then some bad thing will happen. The rule is this is dangerous, therefore I must avoid it. And when I avoid it, that actually works in the short term to make me feel better, but in the long term, it's not working. And so if I make direct contact, then I learn through my experience that I don't need to follow these rules because this is not actually dangerous. I can handle it, etc. Did I summarize what you were saying correctly? Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I think that experience is the important part. A lot of people with anxiety, they have no shortage of people in their lives telling them that what they think is going to happen is wrong, or that there's a remote chance of that happening, or this or that. But without that experience part, it's hard for the learning to take place. It's hard to really let that sink in, really absorb that.
Yeah, and people with anxiety have a lot of rules. And I could say that because I'm also a person with a lot of anxiety. And so, the word rule may not resonate with some of your listeners. They might think, well, I don't have any rules. It's just more like strong beliefs, or these sorts of like programs that, anxiety convinces us is the right way to live our lives. And in some ways, that's anxiety's job, is to convince us to stay away from danger and to do things. So it's very convincing. And as much as people have rules, they often come to therapy looking for a rule as the solution. It's like, tell me what to do all the time, every time, and then I'll just do that from now on, and then I won't have anxiety. And that's not really how it works. And so the experience piece is so key in helping people just get out of that whole paradigm of what is my mind telling me, and what is the rational thing, and more into the bodily five senses lived experience. And, people will often say things like, oh, I didn't realize X about my anxiety, or I didn't realize, it wasn't as hard as I thought, or it was different than I thought it was going to be, because they never actually pushed themselves to try it.
Yeah, so it's getting away from all of that languagey based stuff, whether it's rules or assumptions or predictions or judgments, and really letting repeated direct experience teach you something new about what your former rules and judgments and assumptions were.
And for some clients, it can be a relief to be able to let go of those rules. Particularly with a lot of people with anxiety, they're aware that a lot of things that they're doing are not working. They feel like they should work. And so it can be sort of liberating to say, trying to think my way out of the anxiety. Oh, that doesn't work. It's not that I've not been doing it right, or I've not been trying it hard enough. That just doesn't work for anyone.
And one of the strategies we use in ACT to try to lead people a little bit to get to that place that you're talking about, that, all this stuff I'm doing, maybe it's not working so well for me as like I used to think it was. We call that creative hopelessness. So do you guys want to talk a little bit about what creative hopelessness is and how it's used to sort of set the stage for ACT-informed exposure for anxiety?
Sure. Yeah. So usually in the beginning of treatment, I'll want to spend a little time with a new client and really understand all the things they've tried to combat their anxiety or to deal with their anxiety, and, maybe write a list down and really try to understand which of them work, to what degree, were there side effects of them. People will say things like, oh, I tried meditation, which might sound like it's on the healthier side. They might say, I tried drinking, which is, usually on the less healthy side, has more negative consequences. And the idea is to help people really see what they're doing. Probably most of the time, it's not even clear the strategy that they've been mounting. And part of creative hopelessness is helping them see that most of those things that they've tried all have something in common, which is to get rid of or control their anxiety. And often it doesn't take much for them to see that. And it's not a heavy lift to help people see that what they're doing isn't working. They know that. They've called you to enter therapy. There's sort of an admission that I need help. I need a different perspective. And so it can be really helpful to just lay out very clearly what's been done, and also help a client really feel any loss that's been associated with their experience with anxiety, the things they've given up, the things that they've had to say no to, the things they've regretted, and not just in a cognitive way, but in an emotional way, because that pain can be such a strong motivator later to really experience like, man, this is not helpful what I've been doing, which then creates an openness to try something that is in most cases drastically different.
Right. And so it's not, sometimes people new to ACT are like, why would you want your clients to be hopeless? We don't want them to be hopeless about their life. We want them to be hopeless about the strategies that they've been using that make them feel better for very short term and temporarily, but that really in the long run have not been working, and that hopelessness will make them more willing to give up those unhelpful strategies to try something different, which is acceptance.
It's hard to find something that's going to work if you're still doing things that are not working.
Yeah. One thing that I like to make sure to say to clients is that like everything you're doing actually does work. It works or you wouldn't do it, right? I mean, like every single thing we do or don't do has a function. Like even procrastination works. We can all agree it's quote unquote bad, but it works or we wouldn't do it, right? The moment you give yourself permission to put off that dreaded task, you get relief. And I feel like that's important to sort of validate, like, because people come in feeling so bad. Why do I keep doing this? I know procrastination is bad, or whatever their avoidance strategy is. Well, because it works. It works or you wouldn't do it. But then really looking at, but what is it costing you in the long run? And what is it costing in terms of your values and the life you want and the person that you want to be? And then also sort of taking that a step further, that like not all avoidance is bad. And sometimes, if it doesn't have a cost, and sometimes I use silly examples that have nothing to do with whatever they're in therapy for. So for example, I just gave this one at a training. Let's say it's pouring rain and you decide you want to use an umbrella, and it changes the way you feel, right? You're now no longer cold and wet. So technically that's an example of avoidance. Is it bad? And, I always trick everybody because they're like, no, that's not bad. But of course the answer is always, it depends. Right? It depends. If you're walking down the street alone, there's probably no cost. But if you're at a Red Sox game, a crowded Red Sox game with people near you, and it starts to rain and you have one of those gigantic umbrellas that you put up, you're now blocking a bunch of people's views and probably banging into the people next to you. So if you care about your community and the way you treat other people, now this is coming at a cost that's related to your values. And so this may not be an optimal strategy in that context.
Yes. Yeah. And that's when I describe psychological flexibility, that's being in contact with the present moment, like seeing clearly the big picture. And that highlights the idea that there are no rules. Like there's not opening umbrella it's not always this or always that. It depends on what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, so what I think a lot of newer ACT therapists worry about is like, but okay, so you do that creative hopelessness thing and like you hope that people see that all the strategies they're using to avoid their anxiety aren't really working very well and keeping them stuck in the long term. But then how do you sell acceptance? Like now you have to say, okay, if you're not doing that anymore, that means you have to accept your anxiety. Do you have favorite like metaphors or exercises or something that you found to be a particularly effective way of kind of quote unquote selling exposure that isn't aimed at symptom reduction, but really about like letting go of control and practicing willingness or acceptance instead?
Because one thing I talk about is developing a new relationship with something, that when you have some sort of kind of fear response towards something, that sort of through exposure and through practicing acceptance, we can sort of create a little chart where you have the X equals threat. So the thing that you're avoiding is some sort of threat, whatever that is, that if you stay in contact with it and you're able to be present with your experience, then you can develop new learning that it's not a threat, or I like to say maybe you're probably not a threat, because anxiety always wants certainty, but our anxiety tends to overestimate the danger of something.
Yeah. And I definitely lean on a new relationship, new experience of anxiety. I'll often say something which is sort of similar to that. I'll tell a client, what I really want for you is for you to be able to make decisions in your life based on what you want, not what your anxiety is telling you what you can or can't do. And usually that's a pretty easy sell. Clients are like, oh yeah, sign me up for that. That would be great. So it's not, acceptance is not the end of the road. It's acceptance in service of having a fuller life, having more values-based activities in one's life. And that's pretty easy to sell to most clients. I think some clients don't resonate with that as much. There are some clients, Brian and I talk about this in the book, that, are living pretty full lives. They've got, great situations. It's just that anxiety is more of like a quality of life thing. So it's not really preventing them from doing anything big. So, sometimes it's a little bit of a trickier sell, but I think most people can resonate with the idea of having greater flexibility and showing up in the way I want to.
Yeah, I want the freedom to be in charge of my life, not my anxiety to be
exactly
in charge of my life. Yeah. And it does, as we've said, it's not always effective. I actually had a client once who had agoraphobia, or was it a fear of heights? No, I think it was agoraphobia. That meant it was either agoraphobia, fear of heights, but he couldn't get on elevators. He was afraid to ride elevators. And he had done fairly well in therapy up to a certain point. And then ultimately, like, he did not really get better. He ended up dropping out of treatment. But what we figured out before that happened is that there was like this secondary gain for him in terms of he was living at home and he didn't have a job and he didn't particularly want to get a job. And he was living in a major city where to go to interviews, he often would have to like go to the top of skyscrapers in elevators. And he didn't really particularly want to be going to interviews at the top of skyscrapers in elevators because he didn't really particularly want to be going back to work. And I've thought of him often because at that time I was doing sort of just strict traditional exposure. And when I think back to that, I think, if I had known more about ACT then and really could have talked to him about his values and what he did want out of his life, I feel like I might have been able to take that ball, over the, what do you call it in football? The final yard line. I can't think of you know what I'm saying, yeah. Right? Like those final few yards that I didn't understand the function of it until it was like kind of too late at that point.
Right.
And I also feel like we could have made it about something else if I had had that values piece at the time. Now I know.
Yeah. And I would just add quickly that, I think Brian and I practice similarly. And, the three of us wrote this book really based on our own experience working with exposure. And I think we both see the value, and I think Joanne's on the same page. We see the value in constructing exposures that are around values. But that also can be an obstacle to treatment if you're too rigid about that. So we also see a value in just arbitrary practice where it may not be directly connected to a value, but usually there's some values that you can help a client identify in even something that feels arbitrary and not connected to something meaningful, like such as courage or authenticity or, something like that. So I think it's great to think about exposures that are linked to values, but there's also a role for more arbitrary exposures.
Yeah, absolutely. The example I gave you of watching the scary movie clips, there are no obvious values connected to watching scary movies, but there is the thing that you talked about just a minute ago, which is this overarching desire to be able to do anything in his life that isn't being directed by fear. And so learning how to make space for fear gives him more space to be able to make choices that aren't based on fear. So it's less directly connected to values than the music example, but it's like kind of more globally connected to his values.
Yeah, I think it's important to see values and exposure as a two-way street. That I think it's common to think or talk about it as connecting values in order to engage in exposure. At the same time, I think in kind of doing exposure work in expanding psychological flexibility, sort of clearing away some of the clutter of fusion and avoidance, I think also allows people to contact values that people are often leading these very restricted lives. And I've seen clients where it's almost like something just kind of clicks and suddenly they're doing all these things that they weren't doing before as a result of doing the exposure. Going back to school or getting involved in house projects.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. I love it. So for our listeners who are therapists or our listeners who maybe are not therapists, but interested in doing exposure therapy, or maybe who have friends or family who might benefit from exposure, let's talk a little bit about kind of the nitty gritty of like, what does this look like in action? So, with traditional exposure, typically there's like a fear and avoidance hierarchy where you make a list of different stimuli that you're going to confront. People write down a SUDS level, the subjective units of distress score, like how scared they're going to be when they confront these stimuli. And then typically you sort of face the thing that's the easiest and you kind of go up gradually. That's not the only way that it works, but that generally it's most accessible or acceptable to clients to kind of start a little bit easier and work their way up. So how is ACT-informed exposure similar or different in terms of the structure, the setup, what you're doing during exposure? Like, are you talking? Are you getting SUDS ratings throughout the exposure? Walk us through some of that.
That's a big question because I think ACT is a model and there's not necessarily one way to do ACT. And that was kind of one reason why we made the book more process rather than protocol driven. We didn't want to say, oh, here's the one way you do ACT-informed exposure. Here are the things you track. I think some of the key things are you are creating context that tend to narrow psychological flexibility in order to allow clients to practice expanding, strengthening psychological flexibility, trying out new behaviors. That could go in a graduated fashion, or you might sort of skip steps or kind of focus on routes that are kind of more important to that client. I will say, as Brian mentioned, we wrote the book in a spirit of cooperation. And kind of my reading of some of the prolonged exposure manual, moving from easier to harder is kind of less based in theory and more that it tends to be more palatable to the client. I've found just personally that I think, if you do an exposure that's too hard for a client, it sort of doesn't matter how much they value it, they're likely to get overwhelmed and sort of struggle with acceptance. So I think tracking acceptance or willingness in exposure is really important. Otherwise, I've found, if you take something that's too hard, you might have the client kind of working through it indefinitely. But if you kind of move it, I think of willingness or acceptance in ACT as sort of like a muscle that you can strengthen. If you kind of choose a sweet spot where they can practice it, then they strengthen that muscle, then you can move to things that are more difficult. Additionally, in ACT, we try to kind of infuse values, what feels important to them about doing this work, so it doesn't feel like a dry mechanical exercise. Would you add anything to that, Brian?
With the addition of ACT, like one of the things about exposure, I think where a lot of the creativity comes in, and when I supervise new therapists, one of the most common questions is, what do I do during the exposure? What do I say? And I was trained in the old fashioned way where you say nothing, and every 5 minutes you've got a clipboard and you say, give me your number, and they give you the SUDS number. I think there's so much room for creativity. And we talk about in the book how you can actually sometimes target certain processes like diffusion, like self as context. And, you might try to target a particular process in ACT, and you never know if that's actually going to be the target that gets strengthened. Sometimes you target diffusion and the client shows evidence of strengthened acceptance. But I think there's a lot of room for creativity in how we're responding to clients, how we set up the exposure, what we do with them during it, how we debrief it with them, how we check in on their homework. And that's, for me in my own practice, where I'll bring in a lot of the ACT, more traditional ACT concepts and metaphors in those sections.
So can you give some examples of that? Because I think, this is exactly what I'm getting at, is like in this sort of older way, it's asking for the SUDS ratings, right? How anxious are you? And the reason that was developed initially was because we wanted to see evidence of habituation. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think in the earliest version of Edna-FOA exposure, it was like you're supposed to keep doing the exposure until the SUDS goes down by 50%. And we now know that whether people habituate or not is not a predictor of outcome. And so some ACT therapists don't ask for SUDS levels because habituation doesn't matter. I ask for SUDS levels because I want to talk about it in the context of mindfulness. I want you to be paying attention to your experience of fear or anxiety or distress or discomfort, whatever it is you're experiencing in this moment. I want you to be aware of what that feels like, where you feel it, and how intense it is, and whether that's changing over time. Not because I care whether it goes up or down. I mean, not that I don't care, but whether it goes up or down is not going to be impactful in terms of your outcome. But I want you to get good at noticing and observing that experience as a stepping stone to then also, building that willingness muscle, like you said, Brian, in the context of exposure. And so it sounds like you're doing this collaboratively, right? So it's not just here's a list of things we're going to do in order, but let's decide collaboratively, maybe in terms of values, but what would be most useful. But Brian Pilecki, can you talk a little bit about the way that you do weave some of these ACT concepts into exposure sessions?
Sure. Like an example might be, during an exposure, I might ask a client to, I might say, what is your mind telling you? Can you give me a play-by-play of the broadcaster in your mind? What's the commentary? What's going on up there? Or I might ask about what's happening in their body if I'm maybe thinking more about present moment awareness. I might ask them in the middle of an exposure, like, why are we doing this? Why are you doing this right now? Why would you show up to my office and do this like really hard thing? Just to have them say out loud and remind themselves like what's in it for them. I'm not always like targeting one process. I don't want to give that impression. I'm just kind of like describing it that way for the audience. But, sometimes if it's clear that a client might be stuck in one area, like they're very fused with the stories about anxiety, then yeah, I might try a more diffusion oriented thing. And I always remember what Steve Hayes said in a training I took with him years ago, which is a good ACT therapy. Like Brian said, you can do it many different ways, But one consistent thing is you want to move around the hexaflex. If you want to dislodge a piece of cork on the top of a wine bottle, you got to push on all the sides to get movement. And so I try to keep it fresh, keep it interesting, not ask the same questions, because if the exposures get too predictable and routine, then clients, they're less likely to learn something new. They can come into it like prepared. So I try to keep things kind of surprising and interesting for them so that they're not really ever sure what might happen.
Yeah, I love that. That's really cool. And for any newer listeners, or if the term hexaflex is not familiar, this is really just a reference to the 6 core processes of ACT. And for anyone who wants a deep dive on the 6 core processes, you can go to episode 77, which is actually an interview where I'm the guest. So it's a pretty old one. It was before I was a host. But you engage with these 6 core processes as a way to facilitate psychological flexibility. And so that's really what you're talking about, is like building psychological flexibility in the context of these exposures, and doing that by moving around through potentially, not necessarily all of them, but some of the various core processes.
That is the focus. I think it frees you up with the time. That in traditional exposure, you're going for that 50% reduction in SUDS, whereas in ACT, if the goal is to just practice psychological flexibility, that could be in 5 minutes of an exposure, or 10 minutes, or 20 minutes. You're not having to stay in an exposure for an artificially long time trying to get a certain effect. I think ACT really also allows for a lot of therapist flexibility in designing exposures and conducting exposures and being creative with exposure.
Definitely. Are there some common pitfalls or obstacles that might show up either for the client or for the therapist in doing ACT-informed exposure?
We tried to write something that was very practical. I think we all had experiences of doing ACT-informed exposure and having thoughts such as, am I doing this right? Or am I being a bad ACT therapist? And as such, I saw the book as a chance to sort of explore the edges of the model. So rather than present a sort of idealized, well, you orient the client to ACT, they understand all the processes perfectly, you connect every single exposure exercise with values, and they move towards exposure. I think we really wanted to explore kind of the different experiences clients may have. I've had clients that complete treatment and I'm still not certain they quite understand acceptance or willingness. Or sometimes I found myself trying to connect an exposure exercise with values, and I can see the client kind of nodding like, I'll do the exposure exercise, but what is this meaning you're talking about? And so I think sort of fusing with the idea of, ACT informed exposure looks a certain way, I think can risk kind of grading therapist inflexibility. And so that was one thing we tried to be really mindful of. In the book, we tried to present really messy case examples of all sorts of stops and starts and barriers and client misunderstandings, and just to sort of show, okay, it's really a process of exploration, of really getting into the weeds with the client, kind of sidling up next to them and helping them move towards what their goals are.
Yeah, that it's like more the case than not the case that it doesn't go smoothly. We try to normalize that, especially for younger therapists, that it is messy and there's usually some challenge or pitfall or something that comes up, whether it's a client who loses motivation in the middle, a client who has trouble, completing homework, a client who suddenly kind of has a relapse of old control behaviors. That's part of the work. And there's, an opportunity in each of these challenges. And one thing we talked about is like really paying attention to what's happening. So being fully in contact with the present moment, as we talked about as clinicians. So to be curious, like, why is this client not showing evidence of increased flexibility? There's usually something in the context that, might be reinforcing the older control agenda, for
Right.
example.
Some function. Yeah. Yeah. I think I learned my best lesson as a therapist from one of my clients, this was when I was a brand new, first year practicum student, I think. And this was a client who came to treatment for social anxiety. And he was out doing an exposure, and he had gotten kind of like to the top of this hierarchy. We were doing traditional exposure at the time. And it was asking a woman for her number. And he did that on public transportation. And he came into session and he said, part of what we hope happens in terms of new learning is this thing your mind tells you, this bad thing you think is going to happen usually doesn't happen. And then there's a second part to that I had sort of forgotten in the moment that he taught me, which was he came to session and said, well, I did it. I asked a girl for her number and she gave it to me. And the outcome was even worse than I ever could have imagined. And I was like, oh my gosh, what happened? So she gave me her number, but then when I called her, it wasn't her number. Someone else answered, but they were with all her friends and they were all there laughing at me. So it was humiliating for him. And when I tell you that I have never been more panicked than I was in that moment as a brand new therapist, I was like, oh my God, I don't know what to do with this. The worst thing happened. Not the worst, it wasn't even his biggest fear. It was worse than his biggest fear. What am I supposed to do with that? And thankfully he jumped in and rescued me and learned the second half, which is, even if the bad thing happens, it's not usually as bad as you think it's going to be, and you can cope with it. And going back to what we were saying about experience, he got that because that's what he experienced. He just thought, God, these people are jerks. Like, why have I been living my entire life trying to avoid something like this happening? Because when it happened, I just realized, like, this isn't a me problem. This is a them problem. And this is so not worth doing. And it is a moment I will never, ever, ever forget that I am so grateful for, that he learned through experience the lesson that he needed to learn doing exposure. And then he taught me a lesson that I clearly needed to learn as the therapist. And then I had another client who was doing interoceptive exposure. So she had panic attacks and she was spinning around and, deliberately bringing on the symptoms of panic. And she said, I think I'm going to throw up. And I was kind of like, are you really going to throw up? Or is that just your fear, what your mind is telling you? She's like, no, I'm going to throw up. And she did throw up. And I said to her, you're probably going to think I'm weird, but I think this is the best thing that ever could have happened to you. And she just nodded and was like, yep, because this was my worst fear come true. And it really wasn't that bad. And I'm fine. So I love exposure. I just find it to be such a powerful experiential way for people to learn to let go of these old rules that aren't serving them, and to really be able to interact with their environment in a different way that really frees them up to live wholly. And Brian, I loved that you got the experience of Brian Pilecki got the experience of doing exposure as a little boy who had developed a bee phobia. And I love that you start the book with that story and weave that story throughout. And the book is really tremendous. I think you did such an amazing job of writing something that is both useful for people who are already seasoned ACT clinicians, as well as people who really maybe have more of a background in traditional CBT and exposure and really want to learn how to kind of actify the practices that they're already doing. You did a really, really, really nice job. I think it's such a useful resource, and I really encourage people to pick up the book. So if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you to?
I guess you can go to our profiles on portlandpsychotherapy.com and our training page, portlandpsychotherapytraining.com.
Great. Well, we will make sure that we get that link into the show notes. So if people want to learn more, they can find you there. But thank you both so much for joining me. This was a really fun conversation, and I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, and our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.